Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Professor Richard Wolff, an eminent economist and professor, to discuss the wider crisis in capitalism and also what is being done in other places, such as Asia, to create alternatives. So, welcome back to the program.
Glad to be here, Glenn. Very glad.
So, when you read liberal economists' work, such as Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, and others, they do also recognize some internal contradictions in the capitalist system. That is, the tendency for the concentration of wealth, more of the revenue going into capital as opposed to labor with each technological innovation, rent-seeking, debt. But liberal economics has become an ideology, and I think one of the consequences is that the ability to recognize, address, and mitigate some of these internal contradictions has been ignored. And well, since the 1970s, 80s, it seems the problems now have been building up to such an extent, it's very difficult to actually deal with a lot of these major problems which have begun to fester. So I wanted to ask, what do you see as being the wider problem of capitalism today? I mean, what stage are we at?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and the answer is full of the same kinds of contradictions that are in the object of the analysis itself. And let me say a word about that. Um, because, in a way, my origins are European. My father was born in France and my mother in Germany. I was born in the United States and I've lived and worked here all my life, but I carry within me those two languages, which I have spoken all my life, and the culture and the history out of which my family came. And always, for many, many years, it has struck me that the very idea of contradiction is resisted by this culture here in the United States. It's not a comfortable concept. You don't hear people saying in a casual way that everything has a plus and a minus and they're all wrapped up together, and it is not easy to disentangle so that you get a sense of it's going in this direction, but it is not at the same time. That seems very disturbing. I don't know what that's about. I know it has something to do with the religious Puritanism that the Europeans brought with them here. I know that it has to do with a kind of cultural guilt, a collectively burdened notion that the country was built on the basis of ethnic cleansing of the native indigenous population, which was simply exterminated. People who wonder why the United States stands behind Israel. Well, there are many reasons, no question. But one of them is the fact that Israel is doing now what the United States knows it did not so long ago, which is to exterminate the people that it doesn't want to have to deal with who are here. Uh, and so in this country, you don't get an awareness of the contradictions. So let me give you now an example. Capitalism is in deepening trouble here in the United States. I'll be glad to go through with you, if you're interested, all the pieces of evidence that strike me as leading to that conclusion. But at the same time, if by capitalism you mean, as I do, the organization of production between an employer and an employee, that way of organizing, which is both different from slavery or feudalism, importantly different, but also, here goes again, also like those. Masters are few and slaves are many, and lords are few and serfs are many, and employers are few and employees are many. You ought to think about that when you think about it. It doesn't mean that the French Revolution didn't mark the end of feudalism and the arrival of a new system, but the contradiction, it's different, but it is also the same, helps you see what you might otherwise miss. Right now, the employer-employee relationship is stunningly successful in China. And this is not an endorsement of China. I understand China has its problems and its contradictions plenty. But if the world in the last 2 centuries has been busy crawling out from under colonialism as the way the world was organized, it then follows that the overwhelming mass of people living in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have as their probable number one priority not being poor anymore, or to say it differently, achieving economic development as rapidly as they can. Well, then China is the success story. There's really no issue here. If you're looking for a model, that's where you would go. You might want to choose something else if you have some special other reason or you have different values. That's possible. But if and to the extent that you want a dynamic, growing capitalism, the very thing that the United States throughout the 20th century boasted it had achieved relative, say, to Europe, well, then now you have to move to China. You have to understand that capitalism is dynamic there, and it is not here. And the signs of it are everywhere. This morning, we all woke up here in the United States to a new study which shows that the CEO of the Starbucks coffee chain has earns per year over 6,000 times more than the median employee of Starbucks earns. And why is that important? Because it's emblematic, and the research shows that we are living in a society which has the same remarkable continuity over the last 30 years that China has. In China, the continuity is an annual growth rate of GDP in the 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% range. And the United States has nothing remotely like that. We're lucky here if we get 2%. Okay. But equally impressive is the growing inequality of the United States. You know, at the end of World War II, we were less unequal than Europe. Now we have left Europe in the dust in the level of inequality that we have, income inequality, wealth inequality. So it's a capitalism that is unable to do here in the United States what it promised its people across the 20th century. And I really am evidence of that. That's what they taught us in the elementary school. That's what they taught us again in high school. That's what I learned at the university. And that's what I was told when I got my PhD in economics. That the remarkable thing about capitalism is the immense middle class it produced and it sustains. It's all gone now. The confidence is gone. The reality has completely changed. The middle class isn't there anymore. It's literally gone. It's so obvious that even our conventional politicians, who specialize in admitting nothing and saying nothing, attack each other on the grounds that their enemy is destroying the middle class, and their goal is to bring back the middle class. Everybody says it. Nobody does it. It's a little bit like every president, I counted back, I believe 8 or 9, promised to bring manufacturing back to America. Every president, Republican, Democrat, promised it. Absolutely none of them did it. And it doesn't make any difference. The next election, they're busy promising it each other and attacking each other for not having done it, not recognizing the contradiction that they're all guilty of that situation. They have no way out, and there's none on the horizon. The shrinkage of the United States is evident wherever we turn. The spectacle of this last week, and I know you have been addressing it in your other programs, as you certainly should, but I want to make people understand two spectacles that took place in the Oval Office of President Trump. His inauguration back on the 20th of January, when he had sitting behind him not the leading generals, not the leading diplomats, not the leading athletes, not the leading poets. He had Zuckerberg and Jeffrey Bezos and Elon Musk. He had a semicircle of the richest people in the world sitting there, Americans sitting there. Well, earlier this week, he in the same office, the Oval Office, he has himself behind a desk and half the leaders of Europe, Macron, Starmer, Merz, sitting there almost like children, begging, because that's what they were doing, not to be treated as disposable subordinates while he treated them as disposable subordinates, which is how the United States is treated. The United States cannot afford the role for Europe, and so they are demoting Europe. They don't have enough money to keep them in a very nice doghouse, so they're being pushed out of the nice doghouse into a cheap doghouse. They're being told what they're going to have to suffer with the tariff regime. They're going to have to suffer with much less support militarily. They're going to have to suffer with being dumped into the Ukraine disaster now that the United States doesn't want to play anymore because it has other fish to fry. These are signs both of the United States' difficulty, which is crucial here, and the fact that that means they are going to take advantage of everybody else. I spent a few weeks ago in Montreal, Canada, and I made a real effort to talk to as many Canadians as I can. They are in a state of shock. They never expected, ever, that they would be anything other than the very well-treated nephew of the United States, who would get nice presents, be treated very nicely, and the idea that they are being made to suffer all kinds of ways, they literally cannot understand what happened. They feel almost personally betrayed, which is a way of saying they didn't get the whole relationship. They don't understand why it has been so easy, so quick for Mr. Trump to do all of this. And of course, they don't want to face the reality that for Mr. Trump to be in the position he's in tells you already that the support in the United States for what he's doing was already there, just waiting for somebody who would do it, because it would be a political opportunity not to be missed. And that's what Mr. Trump and his allies have understood.
You know, in the early 19th century, when Alexis de Tocqueville went to the United States, he made the comment that one of the reasons why democracy would work in the U.S. is because there was a lower concentration of wealth there as opposed to in Europe. Now, of course, things, as you suggested, have been turned a little bit on its head since those days. It doesn't mean that Europe doesn't have the same problem, but I think, we see that it's a more severe situation in the United States. But it doesn't seem only to be a an American problem, though, the wider one. I mean, after this long period of globalization, it does undermine, it does put capitalism and, in a hyperdrive, but it also seems to undermine its foundation because usually governments, they do recognize that there's a tendency for capital to concentrate, which undermines this relationship with labor. So the role of a government is always to have some socialist policies to make sure labor isn't squeezed. But if you look in countries, for example, your family's background from France, they have a dilemma. Either in this globalized market, they can either cut benefits, cut salaries, or they can shut the doors to the factories, and because they can't compete with Bangladesh. So they're no longer in a position to help labor anymore. Instead, they have to give the capital owners the ability to rule however they will and put the squeeze on labor in order to actually compete in this cut-through market. But I guess my point is, if this is what you do, you keep squeezing the people, the worker. How far can you do it before you have a consumer-driven economy where you don't have consumer with any purchasing power? I mean, is this the capitalism killing itself? How do you see this?
Well, let's go back to the beginning. The way I see this is, you know, everything is contradictory. Life is a matter of navigating, if I could use such a metaphor, your contradictions, not pretending that they aren't there, not pretending that you can simply go in one direction without that having contradictory effects. But we live in a country which I do think is a little different from Europe. We live in a country where there is a real strong belief in the ability of private capitalism to overcome all problems, to resolve all difficulties, to manage its own contradictions, if that's even admitted, without worrying. You are watching, by the way, right now in the United States, a spectacular movement that is fully contradictory. I mean, let me give you a couple of examples to drive it home. On the one hand, you are destroying most of the social programs that the federal government normally administers in this country that have developed over at least the last 150 years. He's abolishing the education department. He's abolishing the foreign aid department. He's abolishing all number, in the name of efficiency. Absolutely no one takes that seriously, but and the rationale, we don't need the public. The private will take care of it. Yeah, but at the same time, he is imposing on the private market the greatest regime of tariffs imaginable, which is a refusal to allow the private market to function, is a notion that the government is appropriately intervening to literally change at least the price of every import. And if you know how capitalism works, if you change the prices of the imports, you're sooner or later going to change every price as the system adjusts. I don't know if you caught it, but last week they announced that instead of giving a grant to the Intel Corporation, which is collapsing, the government is going to take a 10% position. It's going to give the Intel Corporation an enormous amount of money, but to become a 10% owner of the Intel Corporation. Well, that's a departure. The government used to be governed by the rule, you never do that. You never do that. Or if you do it, it has to be temporary. It has to be exceptional. It has to be enshrouded with qualifiers that make it not last. The government had to intervene in the crisis of 2008 massively. The government took over the major banks. The government took over the largest insurance company in the United States and so on. But it was always spoken about as a temporary emergency, exceptional, and then undone as quickly as either Republicans All of that's gone. The protectionism that the tariff war shows you is an act of desperation, especially when undertaken by people like this, who at the same time that they are intervening are getting rid of government agencies on the grounds that you don't need the government to do these things that the government is now doing more than ever. And that contradiction is obvious, but yet invisible. It may be obvious to you, but invisible to the American culture. And whether it's the New York Times or the others, they don't want to see it. And it's as true of the Democrats as it is of the Republicans, because they're all caught up in an inability to face any of this. When I said to you a few moments ago that there's a decline of the capitalism of the West, whereas it's doing very well in the East and the South, it's finding new areas to be very successful and to grow and to sink very deep roots, which, if you're a critic of capitalism, as I am, is not all good news, not at all. But it is clearly declining here. And I live in a culture in which the only way to describe the reaction in one word is denial. We live in a society which cannot face this. I do know, and I am part of the reason for it, I do know that there's more casual discussion of the United States as a declining empire, flirting all around the culture. You see it here, and that's new. We didn't have that 2-3 years ago. That's already happening, and I'm sure that will get greater. But the dominant view in this country, among particularly the elite that runs the country, is total denial. Irritation when someone says that. Why you say this silly? That's it. Dismissive. It's not an argument they feel the need to refute. That's an argument where you wave your hand and hope it goes away, so that no one should say it. Capitalism is dynamic. Do they worry that the entire stock market is based on literally 8 companies and their extraordinary rise in stocks, Google and Alphabet and all the rest? No, they worry about it. But do they see it as a problem? No. Do they worry about the inequality that is off the chart here? Yes. But do they understand what it means? No. I live in Manhattan, New York City. I'm speaking to you from there now. We just had an election in which the people of New York City, who are overwhelmingly in the Democratic Party, the Republican Party is dead here. It has no strength, no relevance. So if you win the primary, the election inside the Democratic Party for a major position, you pretty much automatically get it in the full election later because the people are overwhelmingly voting Democratic. So we are about to elect, and the polls are pretty strong now, a young, bearded Muslim man who supports the Palestinians. I think that was unimaginable 5 years ago, or for that matter, at any point in the last century. And I could go on and on. Things are happening and changing here that I never expected to live in my lifetime to see. And I'm a little, as you can tell, I'm a little overwhelmed by the strength of the accumulating evidence and the juxtaposition of that evidence and the bland denial. But then again, as good psychology teaches, one of the ways human beings cope with social change that is too much is a combination of denying it. That's one way of coping. And the other one is enacting a theater of pretense. In other words, act as though it weren't happening. Between that and denial, you can manage a response to it. And Mr. Trump is our primary theater actor in being in charge. He has to be the man, the powerful man. He had to arrange the chairs. So Mr. Macron has to look up at him and Mr. Starmer, and they all have to come and ask. You had, I believe, your NATO a spokesperson a few weeks ago refer to him as Papa.
Danny, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, by itself, of course, it's not important. But in the context, I'm telling you, nobody missed it here. This was a moment of great success. And telling the Europeans that Ukraine is their problem is for him rising up above the Europeans, telling them what to do. But I know, speaking to you, I don't mean to hurt anyone's feelings, but there is about American policy now the flavor of a powerful person with enormous contempt for the people subordinate to himself. It's almost as though, as the arrangement dissolves, the antipathy, the contempt for those below can be articulated. And it reflects, which the Europeans will enjoy, it reflects, of course, the long and deeply felt inferiority complex of the ex-colony, that it isn't as developed as La France or Deutschland or Great Britain. So you have that mixture of envy and bitterness, and what's coming out now is a lot of that because it's part of the theater. If we are better than Europe, then we have in some way achieved the reversal that the whole history of the United States was rehearsing to finally be able to do. And Mr. Trump plays, whether he's aware of it or not, I don't know, I don't care, but he plays on that thematic all the time.
Yeah, it also fits within the narrative, though, that if the reason for America's economic troubles is that it was, well, to borrow Trump's word, they were screwed over by the Europeans, then this is kind of the vengeance of them putting things back the way it should be. That is, the Europeans are now lined up in their little chairs and, again, being obedient schoolboys. But I think I always warn that this is a huge mistake by the Europeans, because they think the way they can handle Trump is just to shower him with flattery, say how wonderful, strong leader he is, and just really, bow and subordinate themselves and hope that this will win his support. But my impression is the exact opposite. He sees a weakness to the point where he's kind of lost all respect for the Europeans. I mean, when you have people like Vance who come out and say, listen, we don't need vassals or puppets, we need actual allies. When when your master has to tell you to stop acting like an obedient vassal, then things have gone very, very wrong. But
by the way, the reason, if I could interrupt, the one of the reasons that Trump repeats periodically these stories about how the United States has been victimized for the years, for decades, for generations by evil others. That's really not about Europe. I mean, he applies it to Europe because he applies it blanket everywhere. And the reason he does is because it is the foundation of his presidency. The reason Donald Trump is the president is that he was the only major politician, except for Bernie Sanders, who also did this, but Trump was a legitimate, because he didn't carry the label socialist. Bernie, coming from the left, had a whole nother kind of problem. But those were the two, and Trump, being a conservative, being a businessman, being rich, covered the territory in a way that Sanders couldn't. But here's the point. He went to the white working class male population of the United States. And he said, the last 30 years, you have been abused, you have been hurt in your job, hurt in your income, all of which is true. All of which is a genuinely accurate summary of what happened to them. And it had to do with, very quickly summarized, three things that I would point you to. Number one, a technological revolution, the computer, then the robot, then artificial intelligence, but mostly the computer, which really did a job on the wonderful world of the white male working class in this country. Number two, the outsourcing of jobs, taking away their jobs by moving production to China, India, Brazil, wherever. And number three, bringing in immigrants to replace them. So the technological, the export of jobs, and the immigrants helped to really solve the problem. It gave a tremendous boost to the capitalists of our country who made a fortune by doing these things. And they did it at the expense of the white male working class. And coincidentally, and that's really the word here, at the same time, you had the social movement of the black and brown people demanding help from the government, and the women demanding an end to their subordination. Well, the tableau that emerged among the white male working class was that they were being destroyed by the same government that was helping non-white male men and women, that was attentive to the suffering of the white non-whites and attentive to the suffering of the women, but not attentive to their they felt abused. The ideology of America said you can't blame the corporation, which of course they could have and should have done. That's what Bernie is about. He says, yeah, it's the corporations who decided for profit reasons to automate or to relocate or to bring in immigrants. That you can't, as a conservative, say. And as American ideology goes, that's hard for your workers to accept. But to hate the Chinese, that's easy. And to hate the government of the Democrats and those Republicans who help and are sympathetic to brown and black people and women, that's easy too. And who could do that? Mr. Trump. He's the hero who smashes down the non-whites and smashes down the women and smashes down the evil foreigners, and there is going to reverse the cheating. We've all been cheated. We've all been abused. We've all been taken advantage of. I'm going to reverse all that as your great leader. This is him. He has to interpret everything in the world that way. He has to turn to the Europeans, even if it's totally ridiculous, and say the same thing, because that's his song. That's his motto. That's his raison d'etre, his way of articulating his politics. And he will throw it at the Europeans, who will scratch their heads and wonder, what's he talking about? But he is simply repeating what got him to the presidency and which he believes will keep him there.
Well, this seems to be a bit of a shift, though, in the American economic policy. Is like, I think Trump is his personality makes him a good, well, let's call it delivery system, but a direction it had to go anyways, because the whole the whole free market model was kind of premised on the United States remaining competitive. Again, if we go back to the early 19th century when the British dominated, had the most advanced techs and industries, we saw that, with the American system, the general idea was that free trade should be replaced with fair trade because they didn't want their markets to be saturated by the British. But free market has really thrived when the US was the dominant power. But now that the US doesn't have that competitiveness anymore, I mean, I'm not sure why is it just the rent seekers? Is it becoming too financialized? But either way, if the US is no longer competitive, how does the United States actually recover? Because in some ways it looks like it's building a tribute economy where you would almost force your subordinates to hand over benefits. I'm thinking of this trade agreement they made with the Europeans, where even the Europeans said, "Oh, yeah, this was just garbage. This we had to do it because we can't live without daddy." Was pretty much even what the EU said. But we have others. We have the Panama Canal, Greenland. You have the tech industries in semiconductors in Taiwan. There's across the board there seems to be some push to extract from states. Again, I'm not sure if tribute system would be the right way of characterizing this.
No, I think it is. I think it is a tribute system. The deal with the Europeans, in which the United States puts 15% pretty much across the board, and the Europeans agree to put nothing, the zero tariff or nearly zero, 2% in some cases, and so on. Yes, that is the grossest example I can think of an unfair agreement. And I believe your trade commissioner, European trade commissioner, gave a press conference shortly afterwards in which he said, this is the best we could get, and this is better than other people are getting. Well, what an admission. You're the best among the subordinates. You're doing better in getting the blessing of the master. And the Europeans don't want to face what that meeting and the speeches given by van der Leyen, which are, I must admit, for me, even go beyond. Every American president from now on, every politician aspiring, is now going to have been taught a lesson. When the American economy is squeezed by its problems, take it out on Europe. Make Europe pay money. Make Europe suffer consequences. Do things that are good for your economy, or at least for how you posture as a politician here, by smiting the Europeans and any other culture that you can think of to treat. I mean, the United States bears a lot of guilt for the damage it did in Vietnam. It then hits Vietnam with an enormous tariff, as if there weren't any history that maybe ought to mitigate that kind of it. If you get away with this, you are instructing the political classes of this country to look in those directions. Even if you don't want to call it tribute now, it's going to be pursued as a vehicle for solution. And let me give you the flip side of that. If Mr. Trump imposes a tariff on nearly every country, which he's done, more or less, every politician, every leader of every country now has an argument they didn't have before. Whatever their domestic economic problems, and every country has them, they can now blame the United States. No matter who you are as a politician, Mr. Trump, he hit us with a, and you can turn on the United States and make it into the rogue oppressor of the people of the world. Yesterday, the foreign ministers of China and India met, and they endorsed free trade, the WTO, Everything that Trump is undoing, they are now the champions of. Okay, this is a positioning of the BRICS as the anti-Trump at a time when this is very good for the BRICS and very bad for the United States. These are very costly, deep, long-term mistakes that are being made. And let me give you one more, because it's very important to the politics emerging on the left, both in Europe and here. Mr. Trump, as you rightly notice, is leading the shift away from globalization and free trade and all of that to a protectionist, interventionist, powerful government. Okay, as long as we don't have an economic downturn, that works for him. But the problem is, when we have the next economic downturn, the man in charge is going to attract an awful lot of the blame, even the parts that he's not responsible for. Everyone will be pointing at him. He's the logical person to blame. And there's a long history in this country of doing that. Every time Mr. Trump ran for office, he blamed whoever was in power. Obama the first time, Biden the second. And the Democrats do the same thing. That's our culture of politics. So normally you would blame Trump, but he is so much more the direct intervener at every point that the blame. Look, the Democrats right now have no strategy other than the following. We do nothing. We wait for Mr. Trump to implode, and then we will walk into the White House and we'll walk into the Congress, because the people will suffer and they'll blame him. And we will simply have to say, we're not him. That's their plan. Look, that may work for them. However, I do think that I see now more serious organization outside of the Democratic Party on the political left than I have ever seen in my lifetime here in the United States. You don't have it yet in the form of the new political party Corbyn and his allies are setting up in England. And you don't see it yet in the Bloc II movement on the September 10th in France. But be careful. It is developing here. It will take time. I'm not going to overstate it, but I'm seeing recognition, awareness, willingness to speak up. I mean, to be honest, the standing joke that people on the left in America now say to each other as we all experience the rise of our political fortunes is, we are grateful because Donald Trump is the best organizer we have.
Yeah, well, he is also an organizer for something else, though, and that's actually global peace for some reason. I mean, not the way he thought, perhaps, but if I look towards Asia now, they, which not to the same extent as Europe, but they're still embroiled a bit in bloc politics now that they, well, not just seeing what's being done with proxies such as Ukraine, but they also noticed that, well, they're being tariffed and subordinated, and I guess economic-wise, the Europeans are becoming a cautionary tale that they don't want to end up like this. So you see a bit of a reorganization. That is that now that Modi from India is going to China, they're all recognizing that they do have to work together if the US is no longer reliable. And I guess that's what I wasn't to ask you about, what alternatives are coming, because Unlike the Europeans who showed up like good schoolboys and signed anything Trump put in front of them, China said no to the tariffs. They're not gonna start to make any concessions. They didn't give away their TikTok. They're not. They don't want to seem to participate in this tribute economy. So, what do you see at the moment? Because I also hear from American, well, friends, allies, be it South Korea, Japan, that they can't. That they can't have this excessive reliance on the US, but also countries which are friendly, India, Brazil, they're also leaning. Indonesia's taking some big steps, and of course adversarial states, be it China or Russia. So what alternatives do you see countries flooding to, if not if when now we see that they no longer believe they can rely on the United States?
Well, my suspicion is that what we're going to see now, especially because what Trump is doing has not generated any visible signs in the capitalist class of the United States against it. In other words, they wouldn't have done it, but they're okay with him doing it. And that has to do with the dominance of the financial sector here in the United States, which sees a world changing as important for them to adjust to, but not, at least not yet, a threat. And therein lies an ironic contradiction. My suspicion is that every company in the world that is engaged in international trade has now been taught a blunt, clear lesson. You must reduce any actual or potential dependence on the United States. It is simply too dangerous to your profits, to your survival. Don't sell somewhere else, buy somewhere else, diversify your sources, diversify your market outlets, watch out for the capital flows, stop using American equipment. The irony of the United States telling the world not to buy phone equipment from Huawei or something like that was always ridiculous, because the reason the United States can listen in on Merkel's conversations was because they all use technology from Silicon Valley, which is full of those mechanisms of listening or copying and so forth. They're all going to back away from the United States, number one, because it's dangerous. But number two, because China and the BRICS is now a larger economic unit. I mean, I'm aware of African countries creating a mission to go to the advanced part of the world to get money for a railroad they want to build and a harbor. Okay, they go to Washington, London, Paris. They make their presentations. They sit down with the minister and the bankers, and they get an offer. But then they don't go home with the offer. They fly directly to New Delhi, Beijing, Sao Paulo, and they basically do the same song and dance again. And then they say to both of them, who's going to give me the better offer? Will you build this many kilometers of rail of this kind, ending in a harbor that you will dig out and the Chinese offer them a better deal? That's it. It's just a better deal. It isn't a better deal that we have to think about. It's an obviously better deal. So even the ones that are not interested, who busily take the deal with China and then send a special delegation of the vice premier to Washington to calm the people in Washington. We're not, don't worry, this and that. That's what's going on. So one side is becoming richer by the minute relative to the other, and the other is becoming more problematic with its rules, its herky-jerky politics, You can't know whether Mr. Trump will raise or lower the tariff. Notice what he's done. He's made everybody aware that not only is there a tariff, but you can't know what the tariff is. It can be delayed, it can be suspended, it can be raised, it can be lowered. You have an agreement. What difference does it make? Canada and Mexico had very complex agreements with the United States. Made very little difference. Still makes very little difference. So I think the whole world is in the process of readjustment, and that readjustment, here's the punchline. The United States set out after World War II to isolate the Soviet Union as their great danger. And they did a pretty good job of doing that. Now the world, reacting to what it saw, is watching the United States continue to try to contain what it can no longer contain. And so the end result of what the United States is doing is to isolate itself. That is the irony of the historic moment. We are isolating us. We are creating more and more of a pressure outside the United States to encapsulate the United States. Let the United States go and be over there. Let the rest of the world get on with it. Even the Europeans are wondering about the deals they maybe ought to be making with China and India, and they're making some. And they understand, whoa, we may have bet on the wrong horse, and it looks like now. And inside the United States, the same awareness could take the following form: that what we need in the world is not to allow the juggernaut of what's left of the United States and its allies to be in an endless military arms race with these others who are bigger than we are, much bigger. And then to take a page from American history and say, the British tried to stop us from being independent, the wars of 1776. They tried again in 1815. They were defeated by the United States both times, after which a deal was made. A deal. And the deal was, okay, Britain, you have the whole world, we take Latin America, and on that basis, we should not bump into each other. You are crazy if you keep fighting British versus French versus, yeah. And they did, and they made World War out of it. But the United States stayed away, busily taking its shit. Well, that kind of deal is no longer available in the world. But another deal between the behemoth here, who's dying and isolated, and the new emergence, the question may be not whether the Americans are willing to do it. The question may become, are the Chinese and the Indians willing to do it, to come to an agreement that limits them both on the grounds that that's a way to avoid the war that ends the whole conversation?
Well, that's a key rule with sanctions, though, or economic coercion, that if you have too harsh sanctions over a prolonged period of time, the sanctioned country will learn to live without you. This is, a commonality, and you saw now with the tariffs being hit on Brazilian coffee and all this, the Chinese responded by removing theirs to have a complete free trade. Same with the Africans, and suddenly all the trade is just shifted over to China. So they don't. There's this meme on the internet that, with Xi Jinping, that they have an evil plan just to lean back and watch America destroy itself. But it appears that we are living that meme a little bit, though.
Yep, I think that's part of what the story is that's going on here. And And I think Americans are slowly, it's painfully slowly, I acknowledge that, but it's not zero. There's growth here of a left. And that's why I think the Corbyn event in England, the number of British people who signed up to join that party in the first week after it's announced, watching all the left parties together get supporting the non-party September 10th program. These are signs, if I allow myself as a non-European to suggest that the mass of the European people are also cringing at what their leaders are doing and how they are behaving. That this is, if I can be a half European for a moment, if you think of the Europeans as the core of the Renaissance, the Reformation, the colonization of the world, look what they have shrunken down to. No more colonies, no more. They're becoming an unimportant corner, despite their wealth, despite their size, an unimportant corner. And that continues to get worse and worse. That you watch the deindustrialization, particularly in Germany, extraordinary for me to watch the Europe out of which I come fallen to this level. There must be a popular feeling somewhere that maybe a change of leadership might make this a little less horrible than it now appears to be. The spectacle of leaders who became leaders in the Cold War, who have been standing behind whatever the United States wants of them all of their political lives, should now make them liable to being asked to move on, because that didn't work out real well.
I think it's what you said for centuries. The Europeans, we were at the front and center of world politics. Well, we were the main subjects, and the rest of the world became our objects. But things have changed now, and the leaders haven't really appreciated it, or at least they might be recognizing it now, which is why the panic is setting in. That we're no longer the subjects; we become the objects. We are the pieces being moved around on the table. We don't have a seat at the table anymore, and we're ending up at the bottom of the food chain. And it's a terrible thing to watch, because they all put their hope that if they bet everything on the partnership with the US, that will be our claim to further global leadership. But instead, they see this, this is isolating us in the world and only stuck with the United States. And then the US doesn't even want to be here anymore. They want to leave. So it's quite a pathetic spectacle, such as what we saw in the Oval Office. But thank you so much for your time. It's always fascinating to speak with you, so I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Glenn, and thank you for your programs, which both I and my students talk about all the time.
Oh, I'm glad to hear. Thank you.